Warning, this video is going to contain some disturbing visuals and imagery, as well as talking about deaths in graphic detail. If this is something that you cannot handle, I recommend clicking off this video. You've been warned. Do you guys remember Total Drama Island? You know, that animated Canadian TV show where there's a bunch of teenagers who go to an island, participate in challenges, and whoever's the last one standing will win a ton of money? Not only do these teenagers compete in challenges, but they also like to cause drama, which, as the name suggests. Total Drama has had a lot of seasons. In total, there are like around, I would say, 9 seasons, I would say. However, what if Total Drama Island was not a reality TV show, and instead it was about the same teenagers fighting for their lives to survive each night? But instead of being eliminated by getting voted off and going to the dock of shame, instead they are eliminated by a gruesome and inevitable death. This is Island of the Slaughtered. Island of the Slaughtered is a horror fanfic written by Tumblr user EV This story follows a serial killer living in the woods of Wawanakwa, which is also the same island that is named in the TV show. There, the contestants from the show are killed one by one due to them being on his property. Something that I do also remembered, or at least was researching this, I remember that the creator ended up deleting the fanfic from what I gathered. Please correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. However, it was archived and you can still find pieces from the fanfic, like the infamous drawings of every contestant who gets killed. This also did end up getting resurfaced on TikTok as well, and there is also an analog horror series of it as well too. I'll link the creator below. In this video, I'm going to be tier ranking every single death in Island of the Slaughtered, and I will be placing them into 5 individual tiers. The bottom tier is the chills category, which is basically a death I didn't really find intense, but it still does, however, give me a bit of goosebumps. Of it is the I feel unsafe category. This is where I thought the death was not traumatizing, but it still gives you the creeps and that uncomfortable feeling. In the middle is the WTF category. This is where I thought this death was bizarre and shocking, but not really the scariest death. Of is the my therapist will hear about this category. This is the death that I thought was absolutely upsetting, but not quite soul crushing. And finally, at the top is the God help us category. This is where I think that this death is the absolute worst and something that you cannot come back from. And truly the stuff of nightmares as well too. Quick disclaimer before I begin ranking, I just want to say that this is all entirely my opinion. So if you see a death that you personally thought was scary and I personally didn't find it scary, please don't freak out over it. Everyone is entitled to their own opinion and so are you. Just don't be an asshole about it. Now that that's out of the way, let's begin. So I'm going to start the deaths in chronological order. Basically the characters who died first all the way to the character who dies last. And I will also share a synopsis on the characters from the show and in the story and how they die. So, let's jump right in. We're going to start off with the first death, which is Ezekiel Miller. Ezekiel is labeled as the homeschooled guy in the show. As the name suggests, he is a homeschooled farm boy from northern Canada who starts as a socially awkward and arrogant contestant on the show. However, in later seasons, he turns into a feral. In the Island of the Slaughtered, however, he unironically is eliminated first. Ezekiel is ambushed and killed by the island's resident serial killer, known as the Man in the Woods. His body is chopped up into pieces and scattered across the campground. Because Zeke was the first person to die and how his death prompted Chris to flee the island cowardly, this one is going into the my therapist will hear about this category. Because the thought of the host of the show just leaving the island while the campers are still on there unattended is pretty horrifying. Especially since Zeke's body parts are scattered on the island and the killer is still on there. That's creepy. On to the next victim, which is Lindsay Top. Lindsay is labeled as the dumb princess. Even though the show stereotypes her as the dumb blonde, she is a kind-hearted, naive, and attractive girl that lacks intelligence. Before her death in Island of the Slaughter, she trusts pretty much everybody on the island, including Chris. But he leaves both her and the other contestants on the island after Zeke's death. On the third day, while the group tries to find a way out, Lindsay ends up getting separated and runs into the killer. Lindsay tries to get away, but finds herself at the edge of a cliff. With nowhere to go, Lindsay is thrown off the cliff and is later found by Beth. Her mouth was stitched shut, her eyeball was sticking out of her socket, a stick impaled her through the forehead, and her ear was missing. After reading that description, this is going into the WTF category because of how bizarre and shocking Lindsay's body ended up after she was pushed off the cliff. Next is Sadie Udna. I'm probably butchering that last name wrong. Sadie is labeled as the sweet girl's friend, and she is the best friend of Katie, who is labeled as the sweet girl. Sadie is portrayed on the show as a cheerful and sensitive girl who is fiercely attached to her lifelong best friend. Both her and Katie share pretty similar traits. However, in Island of the Slaughtered, Katie actually ends up being one of the surviving victims. But Sadie is not so lucky. Katie and Sadie end up running into the killer and they try to escape, but Sadie is caught and fed to the wolves, leaving Katie to watch her die. But not only that, her body ends up growing with vines, mushrooms, and peonies. I probably said that wrong. Like, it is everywhere. I would put this in the WTF category, but because of Katie having to witness all of this, really makes this death more unsettling. So I am putting this in the God help us category. Next is Justin Kalani. Justin is labeled on the show as the eye candy, but is also labeled as the jaw dropping. He is a handsome model who doesn't really talk much, but anytime someone or something looks at his face, they stop because of how gorgeous he is. However, in Island of the Slaughtered, he relies heavily on his vanity and pretty privilege before meeting a gruesome fate. His face is sliced off before his body is dumped into the river. Looking at how Justin is portrayed in the Island of the Slaughtered, it kind of makes his death more of a cautionary tale about what happens when beauty goes unchecked. This one is going into the chills category. Next is Beth Yensten. Beth is labeled as the wannabe in the show. Her personality is that she is a sweet, nerdy, and optimistic contestant. However, on day 14 on the island, Beth thinks she's safe as she heads into the confessional cabin where she encounters the killer inside. Beth doesn't even run, she instead just smiles, which prompts the killer to bash her head in. The killer also removes her braces while leaving her mouth with a permanent smile. The fact she didn't even try to run and instead just somewhat accepted her fate was a choice. But I think what makes this a bit sinister is the creepy smile that she has after she dies. This one is going into the I feel unsafe category. Next is Tyler Kennard. Tyler in the show is labeled as the jock, but also is labeled as the sporto who sucks at sports. In the show, he is a well-meaning and incredibly clumsy jock. However, in Island of the Slaughtered, Tyler runs through the camp forest, but he ends up tripping and is captured by the killer. He is then dragged away into the camp's pig pen and tortured on a medieval-style stretching rack, which results in his limbs, jaw, and neck being elongated and torn apart while he screams in agony. Seeing Tyler's face being completely disfigured while also being frozen in a silent scream really puts you on edge, especially with how long his neck is. Like, he was really in serious pain. This one is going into the God help us category. Next is Noah Baudelier. I really hope I said that right. Noah in the show is labeled as the schemer, but also is labeled as the high IQ. But I also want to label him as the sarcastic one because honestly, some of his lines in the show are really funny.
Dude, nice piercings, Original. Do them yourself?
Yeah, you want one?
No thanks. Can I have my lip back, please? Thanks.
And a lot of good you were.
I'm so ashamed.
You should be, Iron Woman. That was seriously pathetic.
Considering buying myself a life on Craigslist, but having trouble deciding because they are all such a major improvement.
As mentioned before, his personality consists of being sarcastic, cynical, pessimistic, and lazy to most, but he is far from being unethical. On the 20th day is when Noah dies. The killer strangles him and stabs him before throwing his body into the lake. This one is going into the chills category. Next is Bridget Summers. Bridget is labeled as the surfer girl. She is a calm, compassionate surfer girl who loves animals as much as she loves surfing. In the island of the slaughtered, she is ambushed by the killer, is dragged away, and is thrown into a pit of fire where she is burned alive. This one is going into the WTF category. Next is Jeff Algolin and Owen Waterflower. I also want to mention that Owen's last name was pretty confusing because he has two last names. One is Burnham and one is Waterflower, where it's pretty confusing, but I'm just going to call his last name Waterflower. Jeff is labeled as the funniest guy around. His personality consists of not being the smartest contestant, but has a positive attitude with a love for people and is always up for any challenge. As for Owen, he is labeled as the party guy, but is also labeled as the big guy. Owen's personality is being an upbeat, fun-loving, friendly, passionate, and optimistic competitor. Both of their deaths are so yikes, especially since this is a double kill and it's really messed up. First, Jeff is dismembered by the killer while Owen gets knocked out, and the killer sews Jeff's limbs onto Owen's body, resulting in Owen dying from either blood loss or an infection. Yeah. I knew right away that death was going into the God help us category from the get-go. Because I can only imagine how much pain Owen was in during his last moments, but also having to see Jeff's body parts sewn to him. Nope. Nope. No. Next is DJ Benson. DJ on the show is labeled as the brick house with heart, but he is also labeled as the teddy bear, which fits his overall character, but he is also described as being compassionate and very kind to those around him. Also a shame considering his tragic fate in Island of the Slaughtered, as he is pushed off a hill by the killer, which causes him to roll down and getting impaled in the neck by a stick. I would put this lower, but because of how sweet DJ is as a character, only for him to get killed off, I'm putting this in the My Therapist Will Hear About This category. Next is Trent Cooper. Trent is labeled as the cool guy, but also is labeled as the deep and mysterious. Trent is a relaxed, laid-back guy who tends to get along with everyone, also known for his guitar skills, which impresses a lot of people throughout the series. In Island of the Slaughtered, he is impaled by the killer with several meat hooks after he is caught on a bear trap, and to make things more gruesome, he gets his vocal cords flayed out. I am putting this in the My Therapist Will Hear About This category. Next is Harold McGrady V. Harold is labeled as the dweeb, but is also labeled as the uber geek. He is characterized as an awkward-looking dude. He is also mocked for his poor personal hygiene and know-it-all attitude. Despite this, he is resourceful, confident in his knowledge, and skilled in areas like beatboxing, rapping, keyboard, martial arts, and problem solving. In Island of the Slaughtered, his head is slammed twice into a table and then into a TV by the killer. I'm putting this in the chills category. Next is Courtney Satella. Courtney is labeled as the type A, but is also labeled as the overachiever. Courtney is characterized as a perfectionist. She herself comes from an uptight, overachieving family that values winning and discipline. She is bossy, competitive, and sometimes very manipulative. In Island of the Slaughtered, Courtney's leg ends up getting snapped and is beaten to death by the killer before getting hung up by several hooks in a dance position on stage. This one is going into the WTF category. Next is Heather Kasuga. Heather is labeled as the Queen Bee. She is described to be manipulative and vicious. Her death in Island of the Slaughtered involves her being beheaded by the killer before having her head being placed in a fridge. Now, here's what makes this death much more creepy. The reason as to why Heather's head was placed in the fridge was because that the killer thought that she was really pretty and that he wanted to have her head as his own. That alone is enough for me to put that into the God help us category, because it's scary to imagine what somebody could even do to your remains. Poor Heather, man. Finally is Chris McLean. Chris McLean, who is often called the host with the most, is the show host of Total Drama. He is characterized as being overwhelmingly selfish and arrogant, which definitely says a lot about him, especially when we're looking at Island of the Slaughtered, since he literally leaves everybody on the island and refuses to even face the consequences. He does, however, come back to get everybody, except most of them were all killed off. Chris, however, does meet karma when all of the ghosts who were slain on the island presumably murder him, since Chris tried to get the surviving back home in order to save his reputation. Honestly, his death was more satisfying than scary because Chris to me is just an asshole. But aside from that, his death is going into the chills category. And that is all of the deaths ranked in Island of the Slaughtered. Here is the final tier ranking. Now, some people are probably going to ask, well, what happened to the other remaining islanders? As I just said, they all survived. The only survivors were Gwen, Duncan, Katie, Ava, Lashana, Izzy, and Cody, alongside Alejandro and Sierra. Now, to conclude this video, even though all of these deaths were somewhat ranked from least to more scary, I do love how there were efforts to make them scary and to leave the audience with fear. But that's it for this video. If you guys would also like to give your personal rankings, I will link the tier list below this video. And if you guys want to explore Island of the Slaughtered, I recommend reading the story on Wattpad. But I also recommend checking out the analog horror series on TikTok by user Freezus_Christ. Also like to give him credit for the photos that I also used for the transitions as well too. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to give this video a huge thumbs up. And if you are new to this channel, consider hitting that subscribe button and hitting that notification bell so you don't miss any more of my future videos. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all next time. Bye!